In the summer of 2022, a team of archaeologists working at the Daesung-dong Tumuli in Gimhae, South Korea, pulled DNA from 8 skeletons buried between 300 and 500 AD. These were people of the Gaya Confederacy, a loose network of small kingdoms that once controlled the southern tip of the Korean Peninsula before being absorbed into the rising power of Silla. The bones came from a royal funerary complex, one of the most important burial sites in Korean archaeology, and the team expected the genetic results to confirm what everyone already believed about ancient Korea. A tightly knit, genetically uniform population, the ancestors of today's Koreans in a straight, unbroken line. Instead, when the sequencing came back, the researchers found something that did not match the modern population at all. The Gaya skeletons were more genetically diverse than living Koreans are today. Some of the dead in that tomb complex carried ancestry linked to the Jomon people of ancient Japan, a hunter-gatherer population that most models insisted had almost nothing to do with the Korean gene pool. Others clustered more closely with populations from further north. And strangely, the amount of genetic difference between individuals buried side by side in the same tomb complex had nothing to do with their social rank. Tomb owners and human sacrifices, elite burials and shell mound burials, all showed the same scattered, uneven mixture of ancestries. The scientists, led by researcher Père Gelabert, described the finding in blunt terms. The deep past of the Korean Peninsula was more genetically varied than the present. Somewhere between the 5th century and today, that diversity narrowed. A component of ancestry that had once been present in the region, linked to the Jomon population of the Japanese islands, essentially disappeared from the mainstream Korean gene pool, replaced by a more homogeneous population shaped by centuries of relative isolation. That single discovery cracked open a question nobody had fully answered before. If ancient Koreans were more genetically diverse than modern Koreans, then the story of a single, pure, unbroken Korean bloodline stretching back to the dawn of the peninsula was not just oversimplified, it was backwards. And once geneticists started pulling that thread, it led somewhere nobody expected, all the way across the Eurasian continent to the doorstep of Europe. To understand why the Gaya discovery mattered so much, you have to understand the story that had been told about Korean genetics for the better part of a century. Korea sits at the eastern edge of the Asian continent, bordered by mountains, rivers, and sea on almost every side. For decades, that geography was treated as destiny. The assumption baked into most textbooks was simple. Modern humans arrived in the region tens of thousands of years ago, settled in, and then largely stayed put, protected from outside influence by natural barriers and centuries of relative political isolation. Early genetic surveys using blood group markers in the 20th century seemed to support this. Korean populations clustered tightly together, showing far less internal variation than European populations scattered across dozens of distinct language and ethnic groups. The conclusion drawn from that data was that Korea represented one of the more genetically homogeneous populations on the planet, a population that had essentially been sealed off from major outside contact for tens of thousands of years. It was a tidy story. It fit nicely with cultural narratives of Korean identity as ancient, continuous, and distinct. And, for a long time, nobody had the tools to test it properly. That changed with whole genome sequencing. In 2020, a team of researchers published one of the most detailed genetic investigations of Korean ancestry ever conducted, combining 155 ancient genomes with dozens of present-day Korean samples in an effort to map, in far more precision than ever before, exactly where the Korean gene pool actually came from. What they found did not overturn the idea that Koreans share a deep, ancient East Asian foundation. That part of the old story held up. The oldest layer of ancestry traced back to a lineage represented by the roughly 40,000-year-old Tianyuan individual from China, layered with contributions from populations in the region going back thousands of years. But underneath that foundation, the team found something the isolation model could not explain. Mixed into the deep ancestral layers was a detectable signal from populations tied to the central Eurasian steppe, the vast grassland corridor stretching from Mongolia through Kazakhstan and into the region north of the Black and Caspian Seas. This was the same genetic zone that, thousands of years ago, produced the population movements responsible for spreading much of the ancestry found in modern Europeans, Iranians, and populations across South Asia. Finding fingerprints of that same steppe-linked ancestry on the far eastern edge of the continent, buried inside the Korean genome, was not what anyone expected from a population supposedly cut off from the rest of Eurasia for tens of thousands of years. Genome link, genome link. The mitochondrial evidence made the picture even stranger. Mitochondrial DNA passes almost unchanged from mother to child, generation after generation, which makes it one of the best tools scientists have for tracing ancient female lineages across huge stretches of time. When researchers examined Korean mitochondrial haplogroups, they found that while the overall pattern looked broadly East Asian, several of the specific lineages present in the population, including branches labeled G, C, Z, M, and F, told a more complicated story once traced back to their roots. One of these, haplogroup C, is frequently found in ancient remains from the Okunevo culture, a Bronze Age population that lived deep in the central steppe region, in what is now south-central Siberia, thousands of kilometers from the Korean Peninsula. That meant a lineage that could be traced back to steppe populations in the deep past had somehow made its way from the heart of Eurasia into the maternal ancestry of modern Koreans. Nobody in that research team was claiming this proved regular contact between the Korean Peninsula and the far interior of the continent, but the presence of the signal at all, structured and consistent rather than scattered and random, meant that the old idea of Korea as a sealed genetic island simply did not match the data anymore. Neither the male lineage told a parallel story. Y chromosome DNA, passed from father to son, largely unchanged across generations, is one of the clearest ways to trace ancient male migration patterns, because unlike most of the genome, it does not get shuffled and blended every generation. When researchers examined the structure of Y chromosome diversity in Korean populations, they found a pattern that did not look like the genetic signature of a single founding population that had stayed isolated for tens of thousands of years. Instead, it looked like the result of multiple separate waves of male migration arriving into the peninsula at different points across deep history, some of them carrying lineages that trace back to common ancestors shared with populations much further west across the continent. This is where the steppe connection becomes especially interesting, because the steppe corridor running from Mongolia through Central Asia and into Eastern Europe is exactly the kind of geographic pathway that would allow small numbers of migrants, traders, or their descendants to slowly filter eastward across thousands of years, leaving faint but permanent traces behind them wherever they eventually settled. None of this happened in isolation from the archaeological record, and once geneticists started publishing these findings, historians and archaeologists in Korea began revisiting evidence that had been sitting in museum collections for decades, evidence that had never quite fit comfortably into the old isolation narrative. The clearest example comes from the tombs of the Silla kingdom, one of the three kingdoms that dominated the peninsula in the centuries before unification in the 7th century. Silla's royal tombs have produced some of the most spectacular gold crowns in East Asian archaeology, intricate pieces covered in dangling gold spangles and comma-shaped jade ornaments. For decades, scholars noted, almost as an aside, that these crowns bore a striking resemblance in style and construction technique to the gold work produced by Scythian and other steppe nomad cultures that ranged across Central Asia and into southern Russia and Ukraine centuries earlier. The resemblance was treated largely as coincidence, or at best, evidence of indirect cultural diffusion passed hand to hand along vague trade contacts. But alongside the crowns, Silla tombs have also produced glass beads, and those beads have been chemically analyzed. The chemical signatures trace some of them back to glassworking traditions associated with the Roman world and the wider Mediterranean and Middle Eastern trade sphere, meaning these objects, or the raw materials and techniques used to make them, traveled almost the entire length of the Eurasian continent before ending up buried with Korean royalty. For a long time, this was treated as a curiosity, evidence that a few prized luxury goods had trickled along ancient trade networks and eventually reached the Korean elite. With the genetic evidence now sitting alongside it, a different interpretation becomes harder to avoid. Those trade networks were not simply moving beads and metalworking techniques from hand to hand across the continent. In small numbers, over very long stretches of time, they were also moving people. This is where the comparison with European DNA becomes genuinely illuminating, because it works in both directions. Population geneticists, studying the deep ancestry of modern Europeans, have spent the last decade and a half mapping in extraordinary detail how the steppe populations of the Pontic-Caspian region, the grasslands stretching from Ukraine through southern Russia and into Kazakhstan, spread westward into Europe roughly 5,000 years ago, contributing a massive share of the ancestry found in nearly every European population alive today. That migration, driven by groups associated with the Yamnia culture and its descendants, reshaped the genetic map of an entire continent. And it is one of the best documented population movements in all of ancient DNA research. The assumption for years was that this steppe expansion was primarily a westward and southward phenomenon, spreading into Europe, into Iran, into South Asia, but stopping well short of East Asia, blocked by the sheer distance and by the mountain ranges separating the Central Asian steppe from the Pacific coast. The genetic signals now showing up in Korean populations complicate that assumption. They suggest that some of the same population movements that reshaped Europe also sent smaller, thinner tendrils east, deep into East Asia, far enough to leave a permanent, traceable mark on the Korean gene pool. It is not a large contribution. Nobody involved in this research is claiming that Koreans and Europeans are closely related populations. The two groups remain, genetically, about as different as any two major human populations on the planet, shaped by tens of thousands of years of separate history, separate environments, and separate evolutionary pressures. Koreans and Europeans differ sharply in traits, shaped by natural selection, from skin pigmentation to the ability to digest milk into adulthood, to variants tied to cold tolerance and to metabolizing diets historically centered on rice, fermented foods, and seafood rather than dairy and wheat. That part of the old story is not in dispute. What is now in dispute is the idea that these two populations existed on entirely separate genetic tracks, with no meaningful contact for tens of thousands of years. The data increasingly says otherwise. Even a faint, structured signal, appearing consistently across multiple independent samples and multiple analytical methods, is enough to prove that contact happened, however thin, however indirect, passed along through a long chain of intermediate populations across the breadth of the continent. The Gaya kingdom discovery adds a crucial piece to this puzzle because it shows the diversity was not constant across Korean history. It was higher in the past than it is now. That finding matters because it flips a common assumption on its head. Many people imagine ancient populations as more isolated and modern populations as more mixed, shaped by centuries of trade, war, colonization, and eventually globalization. The Gaya evidence suggests the opposite happened on the Korean Peninsula. Ancient Korea, during the Three Kingdoms period roughly 1700 years ago, was a genetic patchwork, a region where populations descended from different ancestral sources, some linked to the Jomon hunter-gatherers of the Japanese archipelago, some linked to mainland populations further north and west, lived and were buried side by side, their differences not tracking neatly with wealth or status. Over the centuries that followed, Asilla unified the peninsula and centuries of relatively stable, centralized rule followed, that internal diversity appears to have narrowed. The Jomon-linked component that shows up clearly in some of the Gaya-era skeletons is largely absent from the modern Korean population, a genetic thread that thinned out and eventually all but disappeared from the mainstream gene pool over the last millennium and a half. In other words, the isolation that later generations of scholars assumed had defined Korean history from the very beginning may actually be a comparatively recent development, a hardening of the gene pool that happened after centuries of much greater ancient mixing, not before it. Once you start looking at Korean genetic history through this lens, other pieces of evidence that scholars had struggled to explain begin falling into place. Bronze working techniques found at early Korean archaeological sites show technical parallels with metallurgical traditions further west across the steppe corridor, parallels that were difficult to explain if the peninsula had truly developed its Bronze Age technology in isolation. Evidence for early horse domestication and horse-related material culture on the peninsula appears earlier than a purely isolated development model would predict, more consistent with knowledge in animals moving in from the steppe zone where horse domestication first took hold. None of these individual pieces of evidence would be enough on their own to overturn the old isolation narrative. But layered together, archaeology, genetics, and material culture increasingly point in the same direction. Korea was not a sealed genetic island quietly developing on its own for tens of thousands of years. It was the eastern terminus of a set of long, thin, ancient corridors connecting it, however faintly, to trade and migration networks that stretched all the way across the continent, corridors that were moving people centuries, and in some cases thousands of years, before the network we now casually call the Silk Road was ever formally established during the Han Dynasty. There is also a striking parallel worth understanding on the immune system side of the genome. Scientists studying human immune genetics pay close attention to a group of genes called the HLA region, one of the most variable parts of the entire human genome, because these genes control how the immune system recognizes and responds to disease. Populations that have remained isolated for very long stretches of time tend to show relatively low diversity in this region, because there has been little new genetic material introduced from outside contact. Populations that have experienced regular contact with outside groups through trade, migration, or conquest tend to show much higher HLA diversity, because every new wave of contact brings immune system variants shaped by exposure to different diseases in different environments. Korean populations, when studied through this lens, do not show the extremely low diversity you would expect from a population that had been almost completely sealed off from outside contact for tens of thousands of years. The diversity is lower than in famously mixed populations like those across Europe, but it is meaningfully higher than a pure isolation model would predict. And researchers have noted that some of the diversity clusters and variants that also appear across Central Asia, and more faintly, in populations further west. This is exactly the kind of genetic fingerprint you would expect to find left behind by centuries of low-level, long-distance contact, rather than by a population that developed in a sealed bubble. What makes all of this more than just an academic curiosity is what it says about how human history actually works on the Korean Peninsula and everywhere else. For most of the 20th century, the dominant historical narrative around the world tended to describe ancient populations as staying largely where they were, developing their cultures and languages in relative isolation from their neighbors, occasionally trading with people nearby, but rarely traveling great distances. Modern ancient DNA research across dozens of populations on every inhabited continent has been steadily dismantling that picture for over a decade. Time and again, when scientists sequence ancient genomes and compare them to modern populations, the story that emerges is one of surprising, repeated long-distance movement. Populations mixing, migrating, and leaving genetic fingerprints in places textbooks insisted they had never been. Korea turns out to be another chapter in that same larger story. The peninsula's geography, mountains to the north, sea on three sides, did slow the pace of outside contact compared to more open regions of the continent. It did not stop it entirely. Over thousands of years, in small numbers, carried by traders, migrants, and possibly small groups of women whose mitochondrial lineages can still be read in the DNA of their descendants today, the outside world reached Korea again and again, leaving traces too faint to show up in blood-type surveys from the 1950s, but unmistakable once whole genome sequencing became possible. The implications of this research go beyond genetics into questions of identity that people in Korea, and honestly, people everywhere, tend to take personally. The idea of a single, pure, unbroken bloodline stretching back to a founding ancestor is a powerful cultural narrative, and versions of it exist in nearly every nation's origin story. Genetics, again and again, tends to complicate those stories rather than confirm them. The evidence coming out of studies like the 2020 whole genome analysis and the 2022 Gaya tomb sequencing does not suggest Korean identity is somehow less real or less distinct because of these findings. If anything, the researchers involved in this work have tended to frame it the opposite way. Modern Korean populations represent the settled, consolidated result of thousands of years of small contributions, arriving from many directions. Northern migrations, bringing people down from Manchuria and the steppe interior, southern and maritime routes, bringing contact across the sea with populations that also contributed to ancient Japan, and thin, persistent threads of contact reaching all the way back into the deep continental interior, connecting the peninsula, faintly but undeniably, to populations that also shaped modern Europe. That is not a story of a fragile identity. It is a story of a population resilient and distinct enough to absorb small contributions from across an entire continent over thousands of years, and still emerge as one of the most culturally and linguistically cohesive nations in the world today. None of this rewrites Korean history overnight, and the scientists behind this research have been careful, appropriately so, about how far the evidence can be pushed. A faint genetic signal is not the same as proof of a specific historical event, a named migration, or a documented moment of contact. Ancient DNA research is still a young field. Samples remain limited compared to the size of the populations being studied, and every new discovery tends to get revised, refined, or occasionally overturned. As more genomes are sequenced and more sophisticated statistical methods are developed. But the overall trajectory of the evidence across multiple independent studies using multiple different methods on multiple different parts of the genome, from mitochondrial lineages to Y chromosome structure to whole genome ancestry modeling to direct ancient DNA extracted from royal tombs, keeps pointing in the same direction. The old model of Korea as one of the most isolated, genetically uniform populations on the planet does not hold up under close examination. The real picture is more complicated, more surprising, and in many ways more interesting. A peninsula at the far eastern edge of the largest landmass on Earth, connected across thousands of years by thin but real threads of contact stretching all the way back toward the same deep Eurasian source that shaped the ancestry of modern Europe. The next time you look at a map of ancient Eurasia with a hard line drawn somewhere around the Central Asian mountains, separating an isolated east from a connected west, remember what the DNA of a few skeletons pulled from a Korean royal tomb in 2022 revealed, and what a detailed genome comparison published 2 years earlier had already started to suggest. That line was never as solid as the old textbooks made it look. People, in small numbers, across enormous distances, over thousands of years, kept finding their way across it, and their descendants are still walking the streets of modern Korea today, carrying inside them a genetic record of contact that history books forgot to write down, but that science, finally, is starting to read.